Welcome to Behind the Sims. At SaberSim, we're a team of professional gamblers, data scientists, and sports nerds building the best DFS optimizer and sports betting model on the market. This podcast is a behind the scenes look at how we do it. Every episode is an unedited recording of our team's actual conversations as we research, analyze, and iterate our way to answering the tough questions in DFS and sports betting. Whether we're answering questions like what's the best way to build your bankroll, analyzing different ways to diversify, or even building new models, we're going to share it all right here and we aren't holding anything back. If you're ready to go deep into what it really takes to win, then this is a podcast for you.
All right, cool. So I'm hopping in for Andy this week while he begins his paternity leave. I guess, Matt, I will just go ahead and let you get us started, maybe with kind of a quick update of where things stand this week.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have. I was hoping that we would have more actual results and data to look at after talking last week. The the summary is that there's just been a lot of roadblocks with setting the contest sim up in the cloud. As we talked about in the previous weeks, we were basically um, the goal was to have the like VMs in the cloud running the contest sims so that we could kick off a bunch of slates at once. So we did basically over the past week or week and a half. I did set up that infrastructure, and it is like mostly or sort of working. So basically, I can kick off slates, and then we basically will run like a build or multiple builds. What we talked about before was for higher variance, for higher sim precision, because there is more randomness involved in terms of the sampling of the sims. We're going to run like multiple builds, and then in the analysis step, we'll just sort of like average out those builds um, to kind of figure out like the average performance of those settings. So each slate we're running, it's probably about 1,500 or more builds of like every combination, every different combination of the three sliders, and then like some of them multiple. The higher the variance, we're doing more builds. I think we're only doing like 3 for the highest, and then like 2 in the middle tier, and then 1 for the lower variance, lower sim precision. So that's all working. Basically, there's just the issue now is that like there's kind of these bottlenecks where if we run a bunch of slates at once, we're like kicking off 10,000 to like 50,000 builds at the same time, and our build infrastructure is not really set. It's set up for our like normal kind of user traffic, which is generally not like every single user running like dozens of builds. It's like it's way higher scale than what our infrastructure is normally accepting. So I discussed this a little bit with Elijah this week. Elijah's sort of been working on just other unrelated projects while I dig into this. So I want to just go over where I'm at with this and kind of the ideas that I've had, which I think are fixing the issues of the kind of the bottleneck, but also I think there'll be improvements to how we use this sim moving forward. So the first thing is that I'm going to set it up to basically like we're going to just run the builds as a separate process and just save the like IDs of all those builds, and all of the lineups and everything are already stored. And so we'll just like run all these builds for all these slates separately, and that way they can kind of be, we can run them in a way that there isn't going to be this bottleneck where they like time out or any of that. We can run it over like a few days, like over the weekend. We did have it set up so that it's not like touching production builds. It's not going to be affecting user builds or our database. I kind of have it like separate from the database, so it's pretty safe to just like run all of those separately, but we want to do it in a way that's not going to like cost us like a ton of money in like server costs and stuff. So we'll do that, and then we have all those builds like already run for all of the slates. And then what we'll do is I'm gonna have the sim essentially like run. We're gonna run the contest sim with just like some like chunks of builds at a time rather than all like 1,500 at a time. That'll help with sort of just splitting those up so that we can run a bunch of them at once. And then we're gonna store both the results of um, the actual contest entries in terms of like their scores and all of the distributions. We're gonna store those in the cloud, and so that way um, we don't have to like do that calculation twice because we already have the sims from the actual like sims of the games. The entries in the contest aren't changing, so like we should only have to do those calculations once. So we're gonna like store those so that like future, if we want to run sims in the future, we don't have to like redo all of the like summing up like the scores of each lineup in each sim. That'll all just be like ready to kind of reuse. And then we're going to do something similar with the lineups where uh, and just to summarize, like the process is like we score the entries, we score the lineups. So like here's the score of each lineup in the contest and each lineup in our build across all of our sims. And then we take those scores and we calculate like the winnings of each lineup in each contest in each sim. And so what we'll do is rather than just before we were kind of just storing the like metrics of like this is the average ROI for this build, this is the median ROI for this build, and all this kind of aggregate summary statistics. And because we want to use this contest sim in the future for not just slider defaults, but like testing new tools, testing how we're sorting the lineups, like testing Saber score, testing whatever we want. It makes sense to just store the raw data there. So we're going to store like all of the the winnings of each lineup in each contest in each sim. We're going to store all that in the cloud so that if we want to come back and say, hey, like how much better or is Saber score better than projected score in terms of pulling out the top 150 lineups out of the 500 lineup build? We don't have to like rerun all the builds and re-simulate all the contests. We can just say like, okay, well, let's take all these builds. We already have like the winnings of each lineup in each sim, and let's just see like how do we maximize like the ROI, or like what's the average ROI of the top 150 by Saber score, the top 150 by projected score. So that's basically what I'm working on. Is like the just to summarize, the two parts of it are preventing those bottlenecks in the processing of all the builds in the cloud, and then also kind of saving our results, like more of the raw data of the results, so that we don't have to duplicate that those calculations, and we can reuse them for other purposes in the future. So that's kind of in progress. I'm pretty close, but I think it'll probably be like what I'm hoping is that today I can at least get to a point where I can kick off a bunch of stuff over the weekend so that next week we can actually dig into the analysis there. So that's that. The other part is what Elijah has been working on the past 2 days, which is kind of looking at the buckets. But before, like, do you guys have any questions about what I was describing with like the changes to that process? Do you want to go over any of that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, so it sounds to me like basically we're trying to build an infrastructure that so that this can be used and be repeatable for other projects later, right? Like there's
Right.
foundations that we're kind of building right now so that we can do this again and do it quicker in the future.
Yeah, pretty much. So, I mean, some of it is not going to be repeatable. If we want to test, like, hey, let's change how we're calculating ownership in the builder, we're going to have to just redo the builds, but we can still reuse like the all of the actual entries in each contest. We only need to score those once, unless we're going to like run new sims. But assuming we are not rerunning the actual game sims, and the contest entries aren't changing. Like we can reuse all of that. So yeah, it's like a few different steps in the process that we don't want to have to recalculate. So even if we had to rerun a bunch of new builds, we could still then sim those builds, like compare those builds against the entry scores in the sims that we already calculated. But if we want to test different ways of like getting lineups from the existing builds, then we don't even have to rerun the builds. We can just, it'll be hopefully a pretty quick process to just like pull in all that data from the cloud and analyze it.
Gotcha. Are we planning on doing something kind of similar like when football starts? And that would probably start, that would probably require rerunning all the builds again, right?
Yeah, obviously. So, that's going to be a whole, right now we're just talking about baseball, but yeah, I mean, now that this infrastructure is up, it should be very easy to kick it off for football. There's obviously a lot more contests and bigger contests for football, but there's fewer games. So, if we hopefully that kind of evens out a little bit. It'll probably be a similar length of time. The only concern would be like for a Millie Maker where there's 200,000 entries.
Yeah.
We have like 200,000 entries, and then each one we're simulating 10,000 times. I think it's going to be a pretty big like file that we're storing. So maybe that's not really going to be viable for like storing that all in the cloud, because that's going to be like just a ton of data. That's, I don't know. We'll see. I'll kind of have to test around with that. But hopefully the goal is to set up the infrastructure so that it's like repeatable for any sport that we have data for and sims for.
Yeah. Okay. The last question I kind of had, so you had said there's other like back testing projects we could do that would not require us to rebuild the lineups. What would be an example of that? Because I'm having a hard time like kind of wrapping my head around that.
So like the one I mentioned was like comparing sorting by projected score and Saber score. So like now when you run a build in SaberSim, it might be a 500 lineup build, but then we take the top 150 by Saber score, and the assumption there is that that Saber score is somewhat correlated to EV. But we haven't, I mean, to be frank, we haven't done like the actual analysis into that. It's just kind of theoretical, like, hey, correlation is good, and upside is good, and you want that, so we're going to sort those to the top. But like, we want to prove that Saber score is good, and then if that analysis shows that for whatever reason, like Saber score isn't a good metric for measuring the EV of a lineup, then we either need to like fix Saber score or not use it, at least for like certain contest types or whatever. Like, it's possible, for cash, we assume that like projected score is probably at least similar to Saber score, because Saber score doesn't incorporate really anything for cash. But like maybe for a 100-man flat payout structure contest, Saber score doesn't really have much value. It's like that's the kind of thing that. But then there's other, I think we've maybe teased this a little bit, but we're working on a like lineup diversifier tool that will take a pool of lineups and not sort them necessarily in a specific way, but pull them out of the pool in a way that reduces your risk while still maintaining plus EV lineups. And so it'll be sort of a natural way of diversifying your pool from your lineup build. And so again, if we already have these builds, then we can test like, okay, let's compare the average ROI and like the median ROI, because that's sort of a metric for like risk, or like maybe the percentage of like the or even like the 25th percentile ROI, as like this is like sort of the downside of the portfolio of lineups as a whole. And so we could say, let's compare the top 150 by Saber score, the top 150 by projection, and the 150 but diversified lineups, and see like in theory the diversified lineups should be lower ROI on average, but much lower risk, so much probably higher median or higher 25th percentile or whatever, and so we can kind of compare, and that'll let us prove like, hey, this diversifier does what we are saying it does, which is it lowers risk. And we have to figure out like how much ROI, average ROI, is like acceptable to sacrifice for that lowered risk. But at the very least, it needs to lower risk. If it doesn't lower risk, there's no point in diversifying your lineups. So, yeah, those are kind of two examples. But basically, anything that's about selecting lineups out of the build where the build doesn't change, but which lineups we're actually playing or testing does change.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah. And I guess one other thing just on top of that is like we could also look at different characteristics of lineups within builds and say like, across all these slates, do like 5-3 stacks do better than 4-3, or how do like like no stack lineups do compare. I mean, obviously, like depending on the build settings, there might not be. It's kind of a biased sample, but I think there's other ways that we could analyze these builds by like looking at or the salary. Like let's look at the EV of each lineup in like salary buckets, like lineups that use are within $300 of the salary cap. How do those do compared to ones that are like more than $1,000? Stuff like that. So.
And when you say all the slates, are we actually saying like every slate from this season, or like what's our?
Yeah, I think we'll see. I think that every slate in the season is overkill.
Yeah,
because it's just like a ton of like we're already running a ton of sims and we're not using like actual results. So it's not like we have this sample size issue. There's a sample size issue in terms of like each slate is unique in terms of like the player pool and the salaries and just the makeup of the slate. Even two identically sized slates, one of them might have like 5 different viable high salary pitchers and another one might be just a bunch of scrub pitchers. And I think like the makeup of the lineups are going to be different in those two. So we want to like have a decent sample of like the different types of slates, but I don't think we need an entire season.
Yeah. So I feel like maybe that's actually like a good transition into the like bucketing conversation, because like a question that comes to mind there is it feels like people just kind of take for granted that like, oh, like a 12 game slate has something in common with other 12 game slates. But I'm curious, and I don't know, I'm sure maybe we don't have like the findings yet to like really prove this, but how are we navigating like answering that question? Like if it actually does, like maybe like what you're saying, like maybe a slate where there are 3 pitchers over 10K that are projected over 20 points is actually more of like a consistent defining characteristic than a 12 game slate. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, we haven't talked too much about that. I'm curious, Elijah, I guess a bit of your thoughts as well, but I think what we could do, so I mean, our plan right to begin with, I think was to sort of just average the results of like the different slate types.
Yeah.
So we might have like 5 different 12 game slates and we just sort of like take the average of those. But like we could kind of look at like if we're noticing pretty big discrepancies in like say one 12 game slate, like high correlation is like the best and another one low correlation is the best. Maybe it's just like variance, but it almost makes you, I mean, I think that gets tricky with when we're determining the slider defaults, is like we can't.
Yeah.
I mean, that might be a place where obviously like we'll set the defaults to be whatever's best overall, but maybe that's a place where users can add a little bit of value if we see like, hey, look, when there's like a bunch of, if we see that there's these different results, maybe we dig into the slates a little bit more. And I think that'll maybe be like a down the road analysis. Like we'll do this initial analysis, get the slider defaults better.
Yeah.
And then like maybe look at the like actual buckets that we have in the app of like, 1 to 100 or like 10 to 100 entries. I don't remember exactly what they are, like 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. Like maybe we change those buckets based on, and we'll get into that a little bit with Elijah. But maybe after that, it's like let's look into if there's these discrepancies and see like are there other characteristics of a slate that impact the optimal sliders, and either we can somehow incorporate that into the defaults in the app, and if not, maybe that's something that we tell users that are listening to Behind the Sims, or we talk about it in office hours. It's like, hey, look, we found that if there's a bunch of like expensive pitchers on the slate, then it's better to have like lower sim precision or something like that. There might just be sort of some rules of thumb, like try adjusting. You're fine with the defaults, but you might get slightly better results if you adjust based on the characteristics. So
cool.
Yeah.
I know we had some other things that I don't want to derail us completely. So I know there were some other things that you guys wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So, I mean, Elijah, I guess you want to go over what, I asked you to look at a couple of days or yesterday with the contest bucketing.
Yeah. I mean, basically, like the end goal of this, as you were just saying, was to come to the conclusion that, okay, for this type of contest, these are the best slider settings. Like, and once we get this running on, like, I guess not every slate, but as you were saying, like a good amount of data, we're going to have to say, okay, by looking at, this many contests for this specific 150 max, 100K entrance, like these are the best options. And so I thought an initial way to begin that analysis to see actually how many contests fit into SaberSim's predefined buckets. I think I just started looking at GPPs for now, just as like an initial scan through it. And on our site, we have 24 different buckets that users can like choose, select between. And so, I guess when we backtest those, it's important to know what that distribution looks like when we like draw conclusions. And yeah, as I was kind of saying before, excluding head-to-heads, like by far the most populated contest in DraftKings for the MLB this year was like single entry sub 100. Like by far, that was like the biggest, most populated contest. So that's just something to like keep in mind. There was like very few contests that were above 50K in across all max user entries. So it's like initial analyses to sort of guide the next step of this and understanding how meaningful the optimal settings are given the sample sizes of each contest bucket. And then that's just like a first step.
Yeah.
I think it's good to know. I think it's important to have these numbers when we go into like the next step of the analysis.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there's obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is like, there's more of those contests, but obviously there's a lot fewer people playing those contests. Yeah. And so like the average user, like SaberSim user or any DFS player is like playing more of the big contests, but I feel like maybe like the smaller slates or just like the sites probably just open up a bunch of these like really small contests. They're probably like 3-mans and stuff like that. That's just like a ton of just these like tiny contests that like some people play, and it's probably like the same people a lot. I mean, especially the higher entry fee ones, it's like all these sharks that are just playing like they just mass enter every single like 3-man or 10-man or whatever contest. And so I think the contest count does matter, but we probably also want to look at like the like number of users that would like unique users. I mean, that's like a little bit more complicated.
Do we
I mean, we have, I guess it depends. I know we don't have like all of the entries for every single contest in our data.
That we're like curious about, like.
Yeah, I mean, we have like the usernames for the contest, so we could look at that. I would be curious, like, I don't know how much of the data you have in front of you, but like within, say, like we ignore all of the like sub 100 entry contests, did you get some numbers on sort of like the rest of them?
Kind of so just outside of like those two, like the 3 max sub like between 100 and 1,000 was like the next one. So above 100, below 1,000, and then after that was like 20 max between 1,000 and 10,000, and those were pretty equal. So a 3 max sub 1,000 and a 20 max 10,000 were both like pretty equal. But yeah, I'd be curious to see once I remove those, because those are like very sizable at the top. So I'm sure the distribution is going to look very different once I pop those out. But definitely the 3 max 1,000 and the 20 max 10,000 were like the
Those-
next.
Yeah.
Probably those dime times that they like. There's always like 10 of those open at like 1,100
Yeah.
entrance.
So
Yeah,
and
and I
guess
think-
yeah. No, go for it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I was going to
Yeah,
say,
so
like, I think entry fee is another variable we can look at as well.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Right, even though that's not a drop down that we have on the app, I think
Yeah.
that would be interesting to look at. Yeah, I mean, just intuitively, like the sites do open up some like single entry 3 max where the number of entrants is like much larger, like where basically the entry limit is much less than, I think the legal max is 3% of total entries in terms of like how many
Mhm.
entries you can enter into a contest has to be
Okay.
3% of the max, other than like assuming it's more than a certain size, I guess, or I guess maybe it's just more than a head-to-head. Anyway, so like I think that there's a limited, from the site's perspective, from DraftKings and FanDuel's perspective, like they don't want to run too many of those contests because they like make a lot more money the more people can enter into them. They make more money in general, and so it makes sense to me that obviously that like the 3 max contest, there's going to be more of the, like if they have a bunch of 10,000 entry contests, they're going to want to let people enter more lineups into them. But that it's interesting that like in theory, like a 1,000 entry contest, someone could enter. I guess it would just be 30 lineups. Yeah, so that 20 max, I guess, makes sense. But if it's like a 5,000 entry contest, then in theory they could make it 150 max.
Yeah.
So I guess like Jordan said, maybe all those dime times that they open where like
Probably
the dime times are really, I mean, not to get too it's like the business side of DraftKings, but obviously it's not like a money maker for them. I guess it's like a kind of user retention thing, or anyway, but yeah, I think for this it might be helpful to, like I said, look at the unique users
I agree.
in these different contests, because obviously like there's going to be more smaller contests. Did you find any buckets where there's just like no date, like no
so there was
contest
like
at all?
there was 6 buckets with nothing. Some of them just like logically didn't make sense. So like if there's like user max 150 but total entries max like sub 10, obviously like that.
Right.
Yeah.
But there was a few, like there were single entries with 50K plus, none of those existed. There was like 2 to 3 entries, which is weird. This one is kind of weird to me. It was 2 to 3 entries, like at least 2 less than 3, and it's a max per user, and between 10 and 50,000 total entries, there was nothing. So 3 max, 10 to 50,000. I didn't see anything, which I don't know. At least to me, like that was a little bit surprising.
I think
NFL
makes
will
sense.
see more.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
But,
and then there was also one. So anything greater than 50K, it looks like there was none that were sub 150 user max.
Yeah.
So that's
sounds
like
right too.
Yeah. So that was like nothing super shocking there, but there's definitely like at least 6 buckets that were offering that. This was just in GPPs too. That like just no contest falling.
Are we doing this particular analysis to see if we want to change the buckets? Is that the idea, so that they like better reflect the lobby? Gotcha.
So that's like the finale. I would say at the beginning we want to see like how we can optimize them based on our buckets, but it gets pretty complicated to try and redefine these buckets, because like how do you want to cluster a contest based on their relative ROIs? Starts to get like pretty like interesting. So I mean that's what we talk about later, but that's like a next step, I would say, after we optimize the current buckets.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting, the decision making there. I mean, we won't decide anything now, but like, do we want to have different buckets for DraftKings and FanDuel? You know, because they're obviously, or Yahoo, like there's different contest types. But yeah, I think it's like part of it is the contests that are actually available, and then the other thing is like how much the optimal settings differ, because all the contest selection on SaberSim only impacts the sliders. So if the optimal sliders don't change, there's not really any point in differentiating the drop downs there.
I was kind of thinking, yeah, like along that line, I'm wondering if there's a way that we can kind of tie this into the profit plan contest selection principles. Like kind of think about like, what are we recommending? What kind of contests are we recommending people enter? What is like a typical portfolio of contests that somebody might enter if they're following us? And then how can we set up the build settings, the buckets and the sliders to best facilitate that? Like we kind of have a pretty good sense of like what somebody's contest buckets might be now if they're following our contest selection principles. I wonder if that I don't know, it might be a clue for us of how we want to break these up. Like somebody asked the other day, of very simple one, should I split up my diversifiers and my elevators? Basically, should I split up my 20 max 150s and my single entry and 3 max? Because it kind of sounds like an easy break point there. And I don't know. That feels like a really logical question for somebody to ask if they've watched the profit plan video.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely going to. Yeah, obviously, like the question we're trying to answer here is how do the slider defaults change with these different buckets? But I think a more practical question for users might be at what point should I run different builds for my different contests?
Yeah.
And I know for like NBA, we would often just recommend just do one build because you're just going to be late swapping, and it's a huge pain to late swap multiple times for all of your different contests. And it's just like, it takes a long time to build, or it doesn't take a long time, but it takes enough time that you're not going to be able to react to 5-minute news. But then for MLB, you might have some more time.
Right.
And so I think we want to, in my opinion, we want to set up these buckets in the app such like we don't want them to be too narrow, I think, because then I think that implies to users that like I should be running different builds for this. But like if there's no meaningful difference between 1,000 to 10,000 and 10,000 to 50,000, then like we should just combine them. Even if there's like a small difference, it feels like it would be better to just combine them so it's clear to users. Like I don't need to run different builds for these two contests. I can just run the same. But if there is a big difference between single entry 100-mans and the big GPPs, which I expect that there will be, then we should split those up. And if you only have time to run one build, then maybe you just choose something in between, settings that are in between the two or whatever. But yeah,
interesting. And speaking about like NBA versus MLB and stuff, like I haven't been here that long for a lot of seasons. So for different sports, are all the buckets the same across every sport for us right now?
They are, but like I think this gets into what you're finding. Like there will be 20 max 50K plus entry, like some of those buckets where you didn't find any contests, there absolutely will be for NFL. And maybe even for NBA, because NFL is the biggest sport by far.
Yeah.
NBA is second. Well, I mean, outside of golf and maybe MMA, but like NFL is biggest, golf is second, and then like NBA is probably third. And so you're gonna the bigger the contests are, like the more options there's gonna be, and like the more you're gonna find like large entry contests with like smaller limits, because like they know for DraftKings and FanDuel, it matters like how many unique users they can get. If you have a 3 max or a single entry contest, then you have to have an equal number of users as like the entries in the contest to fill it, obviously. So for MLB, they know that they can't fill a single entry 50,000.
Yeah, but the
contest.
NFL, it's different. So maybe interesting to see if like different, if you get more granular for those bigger sports in terms of like, instead of just saying 50K plus, like what if the 200K Millie Maker is much different? In the NFL is that different?
Right. But again, like not to go over it too much, but like if there's no difference between a single entry 50,000 contest and a 150 max single entry contest, then we don't need to worry about that distinction. And so
that's interesting. I was just thinking about that as we were talking about it.
Cool. Let's see. I mean, is there anything else anything else interesting that you found in this, Elijah, in terms of like sort of just what contests are available?
Not really. I think the unique users will be very interesting. I think that was like something I kind of missed, and I think that's be a great like next step for this. In terms of what I have now, it's just it's just a lot of like small contests. So I feel like once I
Yeah.
edit that down, there's probably gonna be some more important insights there.
Yeah. I guess I was just kind of thinking one thing with our sims is like we probably don't need to actually run sims on every single tiny. I guess they're so quick that it doesn't really matter, but like
Mhm.
we have 100 different like 10-man contests. I
Yeah.
feel like you only need like a few probably to get a sense, but I guess I don't know, we might as well, but yeah.
Okay.
Um,
That's a good
so
point.
yeah, I do think next steps is probably until I have the
Yeah.
infrastructure ready. Yeah, like digging into unique users probably, and then like the other thing that I think would be interesting is just like within the buckets, if you can get a sense of like the range of like with the entrant, the number of entrants especially, like if there's a bunch of 20 max 1,000 to 10,000, like what's the distribution of like the actual entrants in those contests? Are like they more on the 1,000 side or more on the 10,000 side? Just to see like if they're almost all like less than say 3,000, then maybe our bucket should be more like
Yeah.
1,000 to
No,
3,000.
that makes sense. I'll zoom in
Yeah,
on some of like the more populated buckets and see exactly if
yeah,
within those popular buckets, if they're all biased towards like one specific thing. Then maybe we can get more
yeah,
granular with how we define them. That's a good point.
yeah. And then next steps on my end obviously are finishing up what I talked about with the infrastructure of making it more scalable and reducing those bottlenecks, and then sort of saving the results as we go along, and then kind of like separating out the build process so that that can run and that we can just retrieve those results and reuse them. So
Cool. I'm excited to see where we go. What day do you think makes sense for the next time for us to chat is?
I think probably we want to do a little bit later next week,
Okay.
just to give us some time. I would really like the next one of these to be actually digging into some data. I mean, obviously, like you never know what roadblocks we're gonna have. Hopefully, we'll make more progress this week. At my son's daycare was closed, and so I was only like
Yeah.
part time anyway, and so I think it was just a little trickier to make a ton of progress. But I think next week we'll probably like Thursday, Friday next week.
Cool.
Hopefully, we'll have like a week to be able to actually run some stuff and maybe get some actual data and hopefully like we'll have that deliverable somewhat soon of like let's, regardless of change, like without changing the buckets, can we just like immediately make improvements to the slider defaults, get those into the app so that users can, if there's anything wrong with the current defaults, we just make those immediate improvements for everyone.
Yeah. Cool. Sounds great.
Cool.
All right.
All right.
Well,
thanks guys.
Catch you guys later.
See you guys.
Talk to you later.